If you don't have a lot of time for painting and you're looking for a quick project, then stick around. Welcome to my studio. Okay, I've done a really simple outline of the apple. As you can see here, I've traced mine down from printing out the apple like this, but you can draw it freehand if you want to, but this is just for speed. Okay, quick material run through. The paints that I'm using are Imperial Red, Transparent Yellow, Burnt Umber from Maimeri Blu, and Olive Green from my Mugyo set. But as always, use whichever colours that you have that are nearest. The brushes that I'm using today are from Zen Art supplies. They're very similar to the spotter brushes that I normally use, and they have fine points like this, as well as my number 8 round, also from Zen Art supplies. This is from their Black Tulip selection. I'm using cold press paper today. This is from Etcher, and it's 100% cotton, as well as my beautiful ceramic mixing palettes that I have here. And I will link everything in the description box underneath this video. If you'd like to have access to our traced down drawing and our reference photograph, I will tell you later on how you can obtain them, and because you've asked me to, we're keeping the reference photograph in screen. Now, watercolour is all about building up your colours slowly and gradually, and these are the colours that I'm going to be mixing to begin with. Just taking the watery mix of transparent yellow all over the apple like this with my number 8 round for speed, and just adding a little bit of water as I go through. You'll notice that I have a tiny puddle of water in the centre of my palette, simply because it makes life a lot easier and it means that I'm not flooding my brush with water. Now, I reckon that you can paint this painting easily within an hour, depending on your speed and the level that you're at. But generally speaking, I would say this should take you no more than an hour. Now, please, if it's taking you longer, then that's absolutely fine. But this is a really super quick project. Now, making sure that everything's dry, I'm going to mix these two colours here. So we have green and the brown colour here. So it's burnt umber along with olive green. And as I said at the start, use whichever colours you have. I'm applying this colour onto the stalk of the apple, and this can go all over the stalk, but make sure that your paint is dry. Watercolour is all about building up your colours slowly and carefully to achieve the depth of colour that you want. So if you are new to watercolour painting, I highly recommend that you watch this video all the way through so that you can see that tricky process unfold and see the beautiful painting come to life at the end. You can see me here dropping in the burnt umber to the damp mix of the green tints that I've already put in. Using my fine line brush, this is the number 2.0, I'm just doing the outline of the seed here, making sure that I stay out to the very bright highlight that's on the top. And just blending it through with the damp brush like this. I have a particular way of painting and blending my paints. If you'd like to know in further detail how I do this, I'll put a video on the top of your screen right now that just explains it in a little more detail. I'm applying a watery mix of the transparent yellow to the centre where the core is of the apple here, just using the wet on dry technique, applying that paint directly onto the apple. And just blending it through, making sure that everything's dry. I'm now applying the burnt umber to the side of the stalk where the apple meets the stalk at the core. Cleaning my brush in my tiny little puddle of water and then just blending it through like this to soften out the edges to make sure that they're nice and soft. We don't want any hard edges here, we want it to look really, really natural. And the same on the other side. The stalk wasn't exactly dry when I did this, so the colour ran into the stalk a little bit as I was applying the paint, as you can see, but it doesn't matter, we can lift it out a bit later. So it should be dry, otherwise it will bleed into the wet paint. I'm applying burnt umber in a watery mix to the base of the apple like this. And this will help form the sort of shadowy red tone that we have a little bit later on. Really, really simple to do. And you can see me just softening that through with my damp brush. And just adding a little bit more transparent yellow to the areas that you can see. Don't worry if you don't have these paints or these brushes. As I keep saying, it's really important that you use the paints and the brushes that you're comfortable with, but I will link them in the description underneath this video if you want to take a look for yourself. Okay, once again, everything's dry and I've done a mix of Perial Red in one puddle and Perial Red with transparent yellow in another with a tiny bit of burnt umber. I'm just wetting the paper here, so we're going to be dropping this colour in wet on wet in this tiniest little area here and on the other side of the stalk. And I'm dropping in that red mix, as you can see. Notice how it blurs gently into the existing wash. And I'll do the same on the other side of the stalk. Just dropping it in really, really easily. And the same on the bottom. This is just the Perial Red. And we can now paint over, glazing over that wash that we've already applied, making sure that it's completely dry. Just dropping in that pigment. This is the Perial Red and the burnt umber mix here. As I hit the outside edge of the apple, I'm beginning to take that colour right around the outside edge, as you can see, just using the tip of my fine liner brush. As I work down the apple, I'm just applying water because we're going to be dropping in that red colour into the into the wet paper. Just the tiniest bit of wet, just to make it blur a little bit. As you can see, the red tone is slightly blurring into the apple itself. It just gives it a nice soft look. So if you wet your paper first, just with your brush, and drop in that red colour, you can see how it naturally blurs into the white colour of the apple. And I'm using my brush in a kind of wiggly motion to help it go into that white area like this. And the same on the other side. Now at the start of this video I said if you would like to have access to our line drawings and reference photographs to accompany this tutorial, indeed all of our tutorials here on YouTube, then you may want to consider joining our Facebook group where we have all the line drawings and references there, and we are an amazing community. You can have feedback from me, from your paintings, and our lovely members, and I will link it in the description box underneath this video. I'm also going to be putting the line drawing right at the end of this video, so you can freeze the frame if you want to, if you don't want to go over to Facebook, and you can print it out from there, so be sure to stay right until the end. I'm adding the green paint around the center core of the apple here, as you can see. I'm just adding a tiny bit of it to the Perial Red there, so we have a stronger mix again with that beautiful burnt umber, and making sure that everything's dry before you do this, of course, and then just blending it into the existing paint using my damp brush as before. You can see how I'm just flitting between the colours on my palette here, applying those tones where I feel they are needed, just looking at my reference photograph as I work through. You can see me dropping in some of that mix there. It's Perial Red and burnt umber, with a tiny bit of that olive green. Probably a little bit of transparent yellow in there as well. Now that this outside edge has dried, you can see me just outlining it a little bit more to give it a bit more definition. Just dropping in a tiny bit of that Perial Red and sharpening up that outside edge. Now that the top element is dry, I'm adding a bit more of the red tone like this in a kind of wiggly motion yet again to create the illusion of there being a little bit of texture. You can see the colours I'm mixing here. This is the burnt umber with a tiny bit of red. Once again applying it to the seed, but leaving out that little highlight in the middle. Just applying a tiny bit of that olive green there in a really watery consistency. And now that this is dry, we can enhance the base here using burnt umber. Just building up those layers slowly. This is the mixture of Imperial Red with burnt umber. And blending it through with a damp brush, dropping in some of that Imperial Red. And again on the other side. And always blending it through. This time I'm using my larger brush just to blend those colours together, which is just a damp brush. Add a little bit of neutral tint to the base of this. You haven't got to do this, but it's just a really watery mix of neutral tint like this that I'm going to drop in. If you are finding value in this video, please consider subscribing to our channel where we have new content every Tuesday, and join us on Instagram at The Wonders of Watercolour for lots of different posts and behind the scenes stuff. Oh, and do give us a thumbs up. I just want to take a moment to tell you about our Patreon, which at the time of filming has 4 different membership levels, from mini weekly videos of doodles, vlogs and podcasts to full-length botanical painting tutorials, which are exclusive to Patreon and are of course ad-free. If this is something that interests you, I've put a link in the description below, plus it's a way for you to support my channel. Okay, back to the job in hand. Everything's dry and I've cleaned down my palette so we can mix some new colours here. I'm using burnt umber, Imperial Red with a tiny bit of that gorgeous transparent yellow, and of course we have a thicker mix here of burnt umber as well. So you can see the colours that I'm pointing to here. So you just want them to be a thicker consistency than before. You can build up these colours really slowly now to get them really popping off the page and jumping to life. So you can see that I'm adding a glaze of colour to the base of this apple. This is a mixture of Imperial Red with a tiny bit of transparent yellow, just to glaze over everything to give it a little bit of uniformity. And I'm using the paint that is left on the brush to add some detail like this. Notice how I'm dipping between the colours on my palette as and when I need them. This is actually a watery mix of olive green with a tiny bit of transparent yellow mixed in, and you can see me using the tip of my brush just to add a little bit of detail. Once again, cleaning my brush with a tiny little puddle of paint that I have on my palette, rather than using my jar, which will flood the brush with water. Notice how much richer the mix of burnt umber is at this point. We need to add a little bit more detail, so therefore the paint needs to have a lot more pigment, so we have less water and more pigment to add to this tiny little area here. The paint has dried a little bit on my palette, which means I've got more control. Just adding a tiny bit more of that wash, which is olive green and transparent yellow, and working around the centre like this. Once I've applied the paint, as usual, I blend it through using the tip of my brush and dropping in a little bit of burnt umber like this. The paint is still damp at this point, so it's kind of like a wet in wet. And the outside edge here is dry, so once again picking up the burnt umber and just sharpening up that edge there. The brush I'm using is a size 0.5, so it has a really fine point. These brushes from Zen Art supplies are really beautiful for fine detail. But if you have the spotted brushes, they're also very, very good. I'm mixing here the Imperial Red with the transparent yellow to create this lovely orange tone. And once again, strengthening up this area at the top of the apple like this using burnt umber. I'm just adding a little bit of detail to the stalk here using my fine liner brush, and also outlining the stalk like this, just to make it a little bit more realistic. And strengthening up the darker areas like this to give it the darker values that it's needed at this point. And just adding a tiny bit of detail here and there, and sharpening up that really small pip that we can see. Making sure, of course, to stay out of that strong highlight. Cleaning my brush to my tiny puddle and blending it through. because we've started to build up our layers slowly and gradually throughout this painting, we can continue to add the colours until they're the strength of colour that we need. Had we gone in too heavy-handed too early, we would have ended up with a little bit of a muddy and tidy painting, so it's really important that you build your colours up slowly and carefully, dropping in those colours like this. Just adding a little bit of detail as I work through. Dropping in some burnt umber at the outside edge of the centre like this and sharpening up those little lines as you can see. Once again, going around the outside edge of the apple with a fine line brush. You can see the colours that I'm using off my palette here. I'm actually using my water from the centre that's become a little bit muddy with a mixture of all the colours that I have. It's just a mixture of burnt umber in the middle there that's really, really watery. I'm just using what's left on the in the centre there, but you could just mix a really watery mix of burnt umber to do this. Okay, so we're almost at the end of this tutorial. Remember to stay right until the end where I will put up the line drawing for you to freeze frame and trace down if you want to. I'll also put a playlist at the end so that you can watch further tutorials if you want to click through. I'm going to add another layer of the neutral tint here, but again, you don't have to do that if you don't want to. So click through to the playlist and I'll see you there. Thank you for watching and until next time.